Beachhead by Clifford D. Simak. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that could stop a human planetary survey party. It was a highly specialized unit created for and charged with one purpose only: to establish a bridgehead on an alien planet, to blast out the perimeters of the bridgehead and establish a base where there would be some elbow room, then hold that elbow room against all comers until it was time to go. After the base was once established, the brains of the party got to work. They turned the place inside out. They put it on tape and captured it within the chains of symbols that scribbled in their field books. They pictured it and wrote it and plotted it and reduced it to a neat assembly of keyed and symbolic facts to be inserted in the galactic files. If there was life, and sometimes there was, they prodded it to get reaction. Sometimes the reaction was extremely violent, and other times it was much more dangerously subtle. But there were ways in which to handle both the violent and the subtle, for the Legionnaires and the robotics were trained to a razor's edge and knew nearly all the answers. As we were saying, there was nothing in the universe, so far known, that could stop a human survey party. Tom Decker sat at his ease in the empty lounge and swirled the ice in the highball glass, well contented, watching the first of the robots emerge from the bowels of the cargo space. They dragged a conveyor belt behind them as they emerged, and Decker, sitting idly, watched them drive supports into the ground and rig up the belt. A door clicked open back of Decker, and he turned his head. "May I come in, sir?" Doug Jackson asked. "Certainly," said Decker. Jackson walked to the great curving window and looked out. "What does it look like, sir?" Decker shrugged. "Another job," he said. 6 weeks, 6 months. Depends on what we find." Jackson sat down beside him. "This one looks tough," he said. "Jungle worlds always are a bit meaner than any of the others." Decker grunted at him. "A job," he said, "that's all. Another job to do, another report to file. Then they'll either send out an exploitation gang or a pitiful bunch of bleating colonists." "Or," said Jackson, "they'll file the report and let it gather dust for 1,000 years or so." "They can do anything they want," Decker told him. "We turn it in. What someone else does with it after that is their affair, not ours." They sat quietly, watching the 6 robots roll out the first of the packing cases, rip off its cover and unpack the 7th robot, laying out his various parts neatly in a row in the tramped-down, waist-high grass. Then, working as a team with not a single fumble, they put number 7 together, screwed his brain case into his metal skull, flipped up his energizing switch, and slapped the breastplate home. Number 7 stood groggily for a moment. He swung his arms uncertainly, shook his head from side to side. Then, having oriented himself, he stepped briskly forward, helped the other 6 heave the packing case containing number 8 off the conveyor belt. "Takes a little time this way," said Decker, "but it saves a lot of space. Have to cut our robot crew in half if we didn't pack them at the end of every job. They stow away better." He sipped at his highball speculatively. Jackson lit a cigarette. "Someday," said Jackson, "we're going to run up against something that we can't handle." Decker snorted. "Maybe here," insisted Jackson, gesturing at the nightmare jungle world outside the great curved sweep of the vision plate. "You're a romanticist," Decker told him shortly. "In love with the unexpected. Besides that, you're new. Get a dozen trips under your belt and you won't feel this way." "It could happen," declared Jackson. Decker nodded, almost sleepily. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe it could at that. It never has, but I suppose it could. And when it does, we take it on the lam. It's no part of our job to fight a last-ditch battle. When we bump up against something that's too big to handle, we don't stick around. We don't take any risks." He had another sip. "Nor even calculated risks," he said. The ship rested on the top of a low hill in a small clearing masked by tall grass, sprinkled here and there with patches of exotic flowers. Below the hill a river flowed sluggishly, a broad expanse of chocolate-colored water moving in a sleepy tide through the immense vine-entangled forest. As far as the eye could see, the jungle stretched away, a brooding darkness that even from behind the curving quartz of the vision plate seemed to exude a heady, musty scent of danger that swept up over the grass-covered hilltop. There was no sign of life, but one knew, almost instinctively, that sentiency lurked in the buried pathways and tunnels of the great tree land. Robot number 8 had been energized, and now the 8 split into 2 groups. Ran out 2 packing boxes at a time instead of 1. Soon there were 12 robots, and then they formed themselves into 3 groups. "Like that," said Decker, picking up the conversation where they had left it lying. He gestured with his glass, now empty. "No calculated risks. We send the robots first. They unpack and set up their fellas. Then the whole gang turns to and uncrates the machinery and sets it up and gets it operating. Man doesn't even put his foot in the ground till he has a steel ring around the ship to give him protection." Jackson sighed. "I guess you're right," he said. "Nothing can happen. We don't take any chances. Not a single one." "Why should we?" Decker asked. He heaved himself out of the chair, stood up, and stretched. "Got a job or 2 to do," he said. "Last-minute checks, and so on." "I'll sit here for a while," said Jackson. "I like to watch. I'm new at this. It is fascinating." "You'll get over that," said Decker. "In another 20 years. In his office, Decker lifted the sheaf of preliminary reports off his desk and ran through them slowly, checking each one carefully, filing away in his mind the basic facts of the world outside. He worked stolidly, wetting a big blunt thumb against his out-thrust tongue to flip the report pages off the top of the neat stack and deposit them in not so neat a pile to his right, face downward. Atmosphere, pressure slightly more than Earth, high in oxygen content. Gravity, a bit more than Earth. Temperature, hot. Jungle worlds always were. There was a breeze outside now, he thought. Maybe there'd be a breeze most of the time. That would be a help. Rotation, 36-hour day. Radiation, none of local origin, but some hard stuff getting through from the sun. He made a mental note. Watch that. Bacterial and virus count. As usual, lots of it. Apparently not too dangerous, not with every single soul hypoed and immunized and hormoned to his eyebrows. But you never can be sure, he thought, not entirely sure. No calculated risks, he had told Jackson. But here was a calculated risk, and one you couldn't do a single thing about. If there was a bug that picked you for a host and you weren't loaded for bear to fight him, you took him on and did the best you could. Life factor, a lot of emanations. Probably the vegetation, maybe even the soil, was crawling with all sorts of loathsome life. Vicious stuff, more than likely. But that was something that you took care of as a matter of routine. No use of taking any chances. You went over the ground, even if there was no life, just to be sure there wasn't. A tap came on the door, and he called out for the man to enter. It was Captain Carr, commander of the Legion unit. Carr saluted snappily. Decker did not rise, made his answering salute a sloppy one on purpose. No use, he told himself, of letting the fellow establish any semblance of equality. For there was no equality, in fact. A captain of the Legion did not rank with the commandant of a galactic survey party. "Reporting, sir," said Carr. "We are ready for a landing." Decker rumbled at him. "Fine, Captain, fine." What was the matter with the fool? The Legion always was ready. Always would be ready. That was no more than tradition. Why carry out such an empty, stiff formality? But it was the nature of a man like Carr, he supposed. The Legion, with its rigid discipline, with its ancient pride of service and tradition, Attracted men like Carr was a perfect finishing school for accomplished martinets. Tin soldiers, Decker thought, but accomplished ones, as hard-bitten a gang of fighting men as the galaxy had ever known. They were drilled and disciplined to a razor's edge. Serum and hormone injected against all known diseases of an alien world, trained and educated in alien psychology, and strictly indoctrinated with high survival characteristics which stood up under even the most adverse circumstances. "We shall not be ready for some time, Captain," Decker said. "The robots have just started uncrating." "Very well," said Carr. "We await your orders, sir." "Thank you, Captain," Decker told him, making it quite clear that he wished he would get out. But when Carr turned to go, Decker called him back. "What is it, sir?" asked Carr. "I've been wondering," said Decker. "Just wondering, you understand. Can you imagine any circumstance which might arise that the Legion could not handle?" Carr's expression was a pure delight to see. "I'm afraid, sir," he said, "I don't understand your question." Decker sighed. "I didn't think you would," he said. Before nightfall, the full working force of robots had been uncrated and had set up some of the machines, enough to establish a small circle of alarm posts around the ship. A flamethrower burned a barren circle on the hilltop, stretching 500 feet around the ship. A hard radiations generator took up its painstaking task, pouring pure death into the soil. The toll must have been terrific. In some spots, the ground virtually boiled as the dying life forms fought momentarily and fruitlessly to escape the death that cut them down. The robots rigged up huge batteries of lamps that set the hilltop ablaze with light as bright as day, and the work went on. As yet, no human had set foot outside the ship. Inside the ship, the robot stewards set up a table in the lounge so that the human diners could see what was going on outside. The entire company, except for the Legionnaires who stayed in quarters, had gathered for the meal when Decker came into the room. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said. He strode to the table's head, and the others ranged themselves along the sides. He sat down, and there was a scraping of drawn chairs as the others took their places. He clasped his hands in front of him, and bowed his head, and parted his lips to say the customary words. And then he halted, even as he spoke, and when the words did come, they were different from the ones he had said by rote 1,000 times before. "Dear Father, we are thy servants in an unknown land, and there is a deadly pride upon us. Teach us humility, and lead us to that knowledge, before it is too late, that men, despite their far traveling and their mighty works, still are as children in thy light. Bless the bread we are about to break, we beg thee, and keep us forever in thy compassion. Amen." He lifted his head and looked down the table. Some of them, he saw, were startled. The others were amused. "They wonder if I'm cracking," he thought. "They think the old man's breaking up. And that may be true for all I know. Although I was all right until this afternoon, all right until young Doug Jackson." Platters and plates were being passed up and down the table's length, and there was the commonplace, homely clatter of silverware and china. "This looks an interesting world, sir," said Waldron, the anthropologist. "Dixon and I were up in observation just before the sunset. We thought we saw something down by the river, some sort of life." Decker grunted, scooping fried potatoes out of the bowl onto his plate. "Funny, if we don't run across a lot of life here. The radiation wagon stirred up a lot of it when we went over the field today." "What Waldron and I saw," said Dixon, "looked humanoid." Decker squinted at the biologist. "Sure of that?" he asked. Dixon shook his head. "The seeing was poor. Could not be absolutely sure. Seemed to me there were 2 or 3 of them. Matchstick men." Waldron nodded. "Like a picture a kid would draw," he said. "One stroke for the body." 2 strokes each for arms and legs, a circle for a head, angular, ungraceful, skinny. Graceful enough in motion, though, said Dixon. When they moved, they went like cats, flowed, sort of. We'll know plenty soon enough, Decker told them mildly. In a day or two, we'll flush them. Funny, he thought. On almost every job, someone popped up to report he had spotted humanoids. Usually there weren't any. Usually it was just imagination. Probably wishful thinking, he told himself, the yen of men far away from their fellow men, to find in an alien place a type of life that somehow seemed familiar. Although the usual humanoid, once you met him in the flesh, turned out to be so repulsively alien that alongside him an octopus would seem positively human. Franey, the senior geologist, said, "Been thinking about those mountains in the west of us. The ones we caught sight of when we were coming in. Had a new look about them. New mountains are good to work in. They haven't worn down. Easier to get at whatever's in them." "We'll lay out our first survey lines in that direction," Decker told him. Outside the curving vision plate, the night was alive with the blaze of the batteries of lights. Gleaming robots toiled in shining gangs. Ponderous machines lumbered past. Smaller ones scurried like frightened beetles. To the south, great gouts of flame leaped out, and the sky was painted red with the bursts of a squad of flamethrowers going into action. "Chewing out a landing field," said Decker. "A tongue of forest juts out there. Absolutely level ground like a floor. Won't take a great deal of work to turn it into a field." The stewards brought coffee and brandy and a box of good cigars. Decker and his men settled back in their chairs, taking life easy, watching the work going on outside the ship. "I hate this waiting," Franey said, settling down comfortably to a cigar. "Part of the job," said Decker. Poured some more brandy into his coffee. By dawn, the last machines were set up and either had been moved out to their assigned positions or were parked in the motor pool. The flamers had enlarged the burned-over area, and 3 radiation wagons were busy on their rounds. To the south, the airfield had been finished, and the jets were lined up and waiting in a plumb straight line. Some of the robots, their work done for the moment, formed themselves into solid ranks to shape a solid square, neat and orderly and occupying a minimum of space. They stood there in the square, waiting against the time when they would be needed, a motor pool of robots, a reservoir of manpower. Finally, the gangplank came down, and the Legionnaires marched out in files of 2, with clank and glitter and remorseless precision that put all machines to shame. There were no banners, and there were no drums, for these were useless things, and the Legion, despite its clank and glitter, was an organization of ruthless efficiency. The column wheeled and became a line, and the line broke up, and the platoons moved out toward the Planet Head perimeter. There, machine and Legionnaire and robot manned the frontier Earth had set up on an alien world. Busy robots staked out and set up an open-air pavilion of gaudy striped canvas that rippled in the breeze, set up tables and chairs beneath the shading canvas, moved out a refrigerator filled with refreshments, with extra ice compartments. It was finally safe and comfortable for ordinary men to leave the shelter of the ship. Organization, Decker told himself. Organization and efficiency, and leaving not a thing to chance. Plug every loophole before it was a loophole. Crush possible resistance before it could become resistance. Gain absolute control over a certain number of square feet of planet and operate from there. Later, of course, there were certain chances taken. You couldn't eliminate them all. There would be field trips, and even with all precautions that robot and machine and Legionnaires could offer, there would be certain risks. There would be aerial mapping and surveys, and these too would have elements of chance, but with those elements reduced to the very minimum. And always there would be the base, an absolutely safe and impregnable base to which a field party or a survey flight could retreat, from which reinforcements could be sent out or counteraction taken. Foolproof, he told himself, as foolproof as it could be made. He wondered briefly What had been the matter with him the night before? It had been that young fool Jackson, of course, a capable biochemist, possibly, but certainly the wrong kind of man for a job like this. Something had slipped up. The screening board should have stopped a man like Jackson, should have spotted his emotional instability. Not that he could do any actual harm, of course, but he could be upsetting. An irritant, said Decker. That's what he is. Just an irritant. Decker laid an armful of paraphernalia on the long table underneath the gay pavilion. From it he selected a rolled-up sheet of map paper, unrolled it, spread it flat, and thumbtacked it at 4 corners. On it a portion of the river and the mountains to the westward had been roughly penciled in. The base was represented by a crossed-through square, and the rest of it was blank. But it would be filled in. As the days went by, it would take on shape and form. From the field to the south, a jet whooshed up into the sky, made a lazy turn, and straightened out to streak toward the west. Decker walked to the edge of the pavilion's shade and watched as it dwindled out of sight. That would be Jarvis and Donnelly, assigned to the preliminary survey of the southwest sector between the base and the western mountains. Another jet rose lazily, trailing its column of exhaust, gathered speed and sprang into the sky. Freeman and Johns, he thought. Decker went back to the table, pulled out a chair and sat down. He picked up a pencil and tapped it idly on the almost blank map paper. Behind his back he heard another jet whoom upward from the field. He let his eyes take in the base. Already it was losing its raw, burned-over look. Already it had something of the look of Earth about it, of the efficiency and common sense and get-the-job-done attitude of the man of Earth. Small groups of men stood about the base talking. One of them, he saw, was squatted on the ground, talking things over with 3 squatting robots. Others of them walked about, giving orders, planning, sizing up the situation. Decker grunted with satisfaction. A capable gang of men, he thought. Most of them would have to wait around to really get down to work until the first surveys came in. But even while they waited, they would not be idle. They'd take soil samples and test them. The life that swarmed in the soil would be captured and brought in by grinning robots, and the squirming, vicious things would be pinned down and investigated, photographed, x-rayed, dissected, analyzed, observed, put through reaction tests. Trees and plant and grasses would be dug for a look at the soil strata. The river's water would be analyzed. Scenes would dredge up some of the life it held. Wells would be driven to establish water tables. All of this here at the moment, while they waited for the first preliminary flights to bring back data that would pinpoint other areas worthy of investigation. Once those reports were in, the work would be started in dead earnest. Geologists and mineral men would probe into the planet's hide. Weather observation points would be set up. Botanists would take far-ranging check samples. Each man would do the work for which he had been trained. Field reports would pour back to the base, and they would be correlated and fitted into the picture. Work, then. Work in plenty. Work by day and night. And all the time the base would be a bit of Earth, a few square yards held inviolate against all another world might muster. Decker sat easily in his chair and felt the breeze that came beneath the canvas, a gentle breeze that ruffled through his hair, rattled the papers on the table, and twitched the tacked-down map. It was pleasant here, he thought. But it wouldn't stay pleasant for long. It almost never did. Someday, he thought, I'll find a pleasant planet, a paradise planet where the weather's always perfect, and there's food for the picking of it, and natives that are intelligent to talk with, and companionable in other ways, and I will never leave it. I'll refuse to leave when the ship is ready to cast off. I'll live out my days in a fascinating corner of a lousy galaxy. A galaxy that is gaunt with hunger and mad with savagery and lonely beyond all that can be said of loneliness. He looked up from his reverie and saw Jackson standing at the pavilion's edge, watching him. "What's the matter, Jackson?" Decker asked with sudden bitterness. "Why aren't you—" "They're bringing in a native, sir," said Jackson, breathlessly. "One of the things Waldron and Dixon saw. The robots caught him, sir." The native was humanoid, but he was not human. As Waldron and Dixon had said, he was a matchstick man, a flesh-and-blood extension of a drawing a 4-year-old might make. He was black as the ace of spades, and he wore no clothing, but the eyes that looked out of the pumpkin-shaped head at Decker were bright with light that might have been intelligence. Decker tensed as he looked into those eyes. Then he looked away, saw the men standing silently around the pavilion's edge, silent and waiting, tense as he was. Slowly, Decker reached out his hand to one of the twin headsets of the mentograph. His fingers closed over it, and for a moment he felt a vague but forceful reluctance to put it on his head. It was disturbing to contact, or attempt to contact, an alien mind. It gave one a queasy feeling in the pit of the stomach. It was a thing, he thought, that men never had been intended to do, an experience that was utterly foreign to any human background. He lifted the headset slowly, fitted it over his skull, made a sign toward the second set. For a moment the alien eyes watched him, the creature standing erect and motionless. Courage, thought Decker, raw and naked courage to stand here in this suddenly unfamiliar environment that had blossomed almost overnight on familiar ground, to stand here motionless and erect, surrounded by creatures that must look as if they had dropped from some horrific nightmare. The humanoid took one step closer to the table, reached out a hand, and took the headset. Fumbling with its unfamiliarity, he clamped it on his head, and never, for a moment, did the eyes waver from Decker's eyes, always alert and watchful. Decker forced himself to relax, tried to force his mind into an attitude of peace and calm. That was a thing you had to be careful of. You couldn't scare the critters. You had to lull them, quiet them down, make them feel your friendliness. They would be upset and humpy. A sudden thought, even a suggestion of human brusqueness, would wind them up tighter than a drum. There was intelligence here, he told himself, being careful to keep his mind unruffled. A greater intelligence than one would think looking at the creature. Intelligence enough to know that he should put on the headset. Guts enough to do it. He caught the first faint mental whiff of the matchstick man, and the pit of his stomach contracted suddenly, and there was an ache around his belly. There was nothing in the thing he caught, nothing that could be put in words. But there was an alienness. As a smell is alien. There was a non-human connotation that set one's teeth on edge. He fought back the gagging blackness of repulsive disgust that sought to break the smooth friendliness he held within his mind. We are friendly, Decker forced himself to think. We are friendly, we are friendly, we are friendly, we are friendly, we are... You should not have come, said the thought of the matchstick man. We will not harm you, Decker thought. We are friendly. We will not harm you. We will not harm you. You will never leave, said the humanoid. Let's be friends, thought Decker. Let's be friends. We have gifts. We will help you. We will... You should not have come, said the matchstick thought. But since you are here, you can never leave. Humor him, Decker told himself. Humor him, humor him. All right then, he thought. We will stay. We will stay, and we will be friendly. We will stay and teach you. We will give you the things that we have brought for you, and we will stay with you. You will not leave, said the matchstick man's thought. And there was something so cold and logical and matter-of-fact about the way the thought was delivered that Decker suddenly was cold. The humanoid meant it, meant every word of the thing he said. He was not being dramatic, nor was he blustering, and neither was he bluffing. He actually thought that the humans would not leave, that they would not live to leave the planet. Decker smiled softly to himself. You will die here, said the humanoid thought. Die? Asked Decker. What is die? The matchstick man's thought was pure disgust. Deliberately he reached up and took off the headset, laid it carefully back upon the table. Then he turned and walked away, and not a man made a move to stop him. Decker took off his headset, slammed it on the tabletop. Jackson, he said, pick up a phone and tell the Legion to let him through. Let him leave. Don't try to stop him. He sat limply in his chair and looked at the ring of faces that was watching him. Waldron asked, "What is it, Decker?" "He sentenced us to death," said Decker. "He said he would not allow us to leave the planet. He said that we would die here." "Strong words," said Waldron. "He meant them," Decker said. He lifted a hand, flipped it wearily. "He doesn't know, of course," he said. "He really thinks he can stop us leaving. He thinks that we will die." It was an amusing situation, really, that a naked humanoid should walk out of the jungle and threaten to kill a human survey party. That he should really think that he could do it. That he should be positive about it. But there was not a single smile on any of the faces that looked at Decker. "We can't let it get us," Decker said. "Nevertheless," Waldron declared, "we should take all precautions." Decker nodded. "We'll go on emergency alert immediately," he said. "We'll stay that way until we're sure, until we're..." He halted angrily. Sure of what? Sure that an alien savage who wore no clothing, who had not a sign of culture about him, could wipe out a group of humans protected by a ring of steel, held within a guard of machine and robots and a group of fighting men who knew all there was to know concerning the refinement of dealing out swift and merciless extermination to anything that moved against them? Ridiculous? Of course it was ridiculous. And yet the eyes had held intelligence. The being had had not only intelligence but courage. He had stood within a circle of what, to him, were alien beings, and he had not flinched. He had faced the unknown and said what there was to say, and then had walked away with a dignity any human would have been proud to wear. He had known that the alien beings within the confines of the base were not of his own planet, for he had said they should not have come, and his thought had implied that he was aware they were not of this world of his. He had understood that he was supposed to put on the headset, but whether that was an act more of courage than of intelligence, one would never know, for you could not know if he had realized what the headset had been for. Not knowing, the naked courage of clamping it to his head was an order that could not be measured. "What do you think?" Decker asked Waldron. "We'll have to be careful," Waldron told him evenly. "We'll have to watch our step, take all precautions now that we're warned. But there's nothing to be scared of, nothing we can't handle." "He was bluffing," Dixon said, "trying to scare us into leaving." Decker shook his head. "I don't think he was," he said. "I tried to bluff him, and it didn't work. He's just as sure as we are." The work went on. There was no attack. The jets roared out and thrummed away, mapping the land. Field parties went out cautiously. They were flanked by robots and by legionnaires and preceded by lumbering machines that knifed and tore and burned a roadway through even the most stubborn of the terrain they went up against. Radio weather stations were set up at distant points, and at the base the weather tabulators clicked off the data that the stations sent back. Other field parties were flown into the special areas pinpointed for more extensive exploration and investigation. And nothing happened. The days went past. The weeks went past. The machines and robots watched, and the legionnaires stood ready, and the men hurried with their work to get off the planet. A bed of coal was found and mapped. An iron range was discovered. An area in the mountains to the west crawled with radioactive ores. The botanists found 27 species of edible fruits. The base swarmed with animals that had been trapped as specimens and remained as pets. And a village of the matchstick men was found. It wasn't much of a place. Its huts were primitive. Its sanitation was non-existent. Its people were peaceful. Decker left his chair under the striped pavilion to lead a party to the village. The party entered cautiously, weapons ready, but being very careful not to move too fast, not to speak too quickly, not to make a motion that might be construed as hostile. The natives sat in their doorways and watched them. They did not speak, and they did not move. They simply watched the humans as they marched to the center of the village. Then the robots set up a table and placed a mentograph upon it. Decker sat down in a chair and put one of the headsets on his skull. The rest of the party drew up into a line and waited. Decker waited, and the others waited, and the natives sat in their doorways watching. They waited for an hour, and not a native stirred. None came forward to put on the other headset. Decker waved his hand wearily, took off the headset. "It's no use," he said. "It won't work. Go ahead and take your pictures, do anything you wish, but don't disturb the natives. Don't touch a single thing." He took a handkerchief out of his pocket and mopped his steaming face. Waldron came up and leaned on the table. "What do you make of it?" he asked. Decker shook his head. "It haunts me," he said. "There's just one thing I am thinking. It must be wrong. It can't be right. But I thought of it, and I can't get rid of it." "Sometimes that happens," Waldron said. "No matter how illogical a thing may be, it sticks with a man like a burr inside his brain." "I thought," said Decker, "that they have told us all that they have to tell us, that they have nothing more they wish to say to us." "That's what you thought," said Waldron. Decker nodded. "A funny thing to think," he said. "Out of clear sky. And it can't be right." "I don't know," said Waldron. "Nothing's right here. Notice that they haven't got a single iron tool, not a single scrap of metal in evidence at all. Their cooking utensils are stone, a sort of funny stuff like soapstone. What few tools they have are stone. And yet," Decker told him, "they're intelligent. Look at their eyes. Intelligence there, if you ever saw it. And that fellow who came into the base, he knew what to do with the headset. He knew that we didn't belong in the planet." Waldron sucked thoughtfully at a back tooth. "We better be getting back to base," he said. "It's getting late." He held his wrist in front of him. "My watch has stopped," he said. "What time do you have, Decker?" Decker's arm came up, and Waldron heard the sharp gasp of his breath. Slowly Decker raised his head, looked at the other man. "My watch has stopped, too," he said. And his voice was scarcely louder than a whisper. For a moment they were graven images, eyes matching eyes, and then Waldron jerked his head away. "Assemble," he shouted. "Back to the base, quick!" The men came running. The robots fell into place. The column marched away. The natives sat in their doorway and watched them leave. Decker sat in his camp chair and listened to the canvas of the pavilion snapping softly in the wind, alive in the wind, talking and laughing to itself. The lantern, hung on the ring above his head, swayed gently and cast fleeting shadows that seemed at times to be the shadows of living, moving things. A robot stood quietly by one of the pavilion poles. Stolidly, Decker reached out a finger and stirred the little pile of wheels and springs that lay upon the table. Sinister, he thought. Sinister and queer. The guts of watches lying on the table. Not of two watches alone, not only his and Waldron's watches, but many other watches from the wrists of other men, all of them silent, stilled in their task of marking time. Night had fallen hours before, but the base still was astir with activity that was at once feverish and furtive. Men moved about in the shadows and crossed the glaring patches of brilliance shed by the banks of light set up by the robots many weeks before. Watching them, one would have sensed that they moved with a haunting sense of doom, and one would have known as well that they knew, deep in their inmost hearts, that there was no doom to fear, no definite thing that one could put a finger on and say, this is the thing to fear, no direction that one could point and say, doom lies out there waiting to leap upon us. Just one small thing. Watches had stopped running. And that was a simple thing for which there must be some simple explanation. Except, thought Decker, on an alien planet, no occurrence, no accident or incident can be regarded as a simple thing for which a simple explanation must necessarily be anticipated. For the matrix of cause and effect, the mathematics of chance, may not hold true on alien planets as they hold true on Earth. There was one rule, Decker thought grimly. One rule. Take no chances. That was the one safe rule to follow, the only rule to follow. Following it, he had ordered all field parties back to the base, ordered the crew to prepare the ship for emergency takeoff, had alerted the robots to be ready at an instant to get the machines aboard, to even desert the machines and leave without them if circumstances should dictate that such was necessary. Having done that, there was no more to do but wait. Wait until the field parties came back from their advance camps. Wait until some reason could be assigned to the failure of the watches. It was not a thing, he told himself, that should be allowed to panic one. It was a thing to recognize, not to disregard. It was a thing which made necessary a certain number of precautions, but it was not a thing that should make one lose all sense of proportion. You could not go back to Earth and say, "Well, you see, our watches stopped, and so—" A footstep sounded, and he swung around in his chair. It was Jackson. "What is it, Jackson?" Decker asked. "The camps aren't answering, sir," said Jackson. "The operator has been trying to raise them, and there is no answer. Not a single peep." Decker grunted. "Take it easy," he said. "They will answer. Give them time." He wished, even as he spoke, that he could feel some of the assurance that he tried to put into his voice. For a second, a rising terror mounted in his throat, and he choked it back. "Sit down. We'll sit here and have a beer, and then we'll go down to the radio shack and we'll see what's stirring." He rapped on the table. "Beer," he said. "2 beers." The robot standing by the pavilion pole did not answer. He made his voice louder. The robot did not stir. Decker put his fist upon the table and tried to rise, but his legs suddenly were cold and had turned to water, and he could not raise himself. "Jackson," he panted, "go and tap that robot on the shoulder. Tell him we want some beer." He saw the fear that whitened Jackson's face as he rose and moved slowly forward. Inside himself, starting in the pit of his belly and rising to worry at his throat, he felt the same whiplash terror that Jackson must have felt. Jackson stood beside the robot and reached out a hesitant hand, tapped him gently on the shoulder, tapped him harder, and the robot fell flat upon his face. Feet hammered across the hard-packed earth, heading toward the pavilion. Decker jerked himself around, sat 4 square and solid in his chair, waiting. It was MacDonald, chief engineer. He stopped at the table's edge and gripped its boards with 2 grimy hands. His face was twisted, as if he were about to weep. "The ship, sir. The ship." Decker nodded, almost idly. "I know, Mr. MacDonald. The ship won't run." MacDonald gulped. "The big stuff's all right, sir. But the little gadgets, the injector mechanism, He stopped and stared at Decker. "You knew?" he said. "How did you know?" "I knew," said Decker, "that it would come someday. Not like this, perhaps, but in any one of several ways. I knew that the day would come when our luck would run too thin, when we'd cover all the possibilities but the one that we could not suspect, and that, of course, would be the one that would ruin us." He was thinking. The natives had no metal, no sign of any metal in their camp at all. Their dishes were soapstone, and they wore no ornaments. Their implements were stone, and yet they were intelligent enough, civilized enough, cultured enough to have fabricated metal. For there was metal here, a great deposit of it in the western mountains. They tried, perhaps, many centuries ago, had fashioned metal tools and metal ornaments and had them go to pieces underneath their fingers after a few short weeks. Waldron came into the pavilion on cat-like feet. "The radio's dead," he said, "and the robots are dying like flies. The place is littered with them, just so much scrap steel." Decker nodded. "The little stuff, the finely fabricated, will go first, like watches and radio innards and robot brains and injector mechanisms. After that, it will be the big stuff. The ship will melt into a heap of slag. "The native told us when you had him up here," Waldron said. "You will never leave," he said. "We didn't understand," said Decker. "We thought he was threatening us. And we knew that we were too big, too well guarded for any threat of his to harm us. He wasn't threatening us at all, of course. He was just telling us, warning us maybe, although even then it might have been too late. He might have even felt sorry for us." He made a hopeless gesture with his hand. "What is it?" he asked. "No one knows," said Waldron quietly. "Not yet, at least. We may find out later, but it won't help us any. A microbe, maybe, a virus, something that eats iron after it has been subjected to heat or alloyed with other metals. Something that won't tolerate alloyed metal on the planet. It doesn't go for iron ore. If it did, that deposit we found would have been gone long ago. Possibly the radioactive ore as well." "How does it survive?" asked Decker. "Without stuff to eat, how does it live?" "I wouldn't know," said Waldron. "It might not be a metal-eating organism at all. It might be something else, something in the atmosphere. We tested the atmosphere." But even as the words left his mouth, Decker saw how foolish they were. They had tested the atmosphere. But how could they have detected something they had never run across before? Man's yardstick was limited to the things he knew about, limited by the circle of his own experience. He guarded himself against the obvious and the imaginable. He could not guard himself against the unknowable or the unimaginable. Decker stood up and saw Jackson standing by the pavilion pole, with the robot stretched out at his feet, his metal hide gleaming in the shine of the swaying lantern. "You have your answer," he told the biochemist. "Remember that first day? You talked with me in the lounge?" Jackson nodded. "I remember, sir," he said. His voice was quiet. And suddenly, Decker realized the entire base was quiet. A gust of wind came out of the jungle and rattled the canvas and set the lantern to swaying violently. Now, for the first time since they had landed, he caught in the wind the alien smell of an alien world.